A renowned dancer, on the verge of losing his ability to dance due to a degenerative disease, and a young journalist who arrives to tell his story, find themselves falling in love. As they embark on a final tour filled with challenges and unforgettable moments, a secret threatens to change everything. The echo of applause still resonated in Elliot Carter's memory as he stared at the large window of his apartment. Autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and red, but the dancer felt empty, like a leafless tree. There, at the height of his career, he carried information he dared not share. The diagnosis had been a devastating blow, a degenerative disease that would gradually take away his ability to dance. For a man whose identity was inseparable from his art, it was akin to a death sentence. The living room was silent, except for the soft crackle of vinyl playing in the background. A classical melody, something a young Elliot would have loved to dance to. Now, the sound was just another cruel reminder of what he was about to lose. The phone vibrated on the table. A message from his agent informed him of an interview with Grace Collins, a cultural journalist writing for one of the country's most renowned magazines. Elliot sighed. He had already decided this would be his last season. Perhaps it was good to leave something documented for posterity, even though the thought filled him with melancholy. With a resigned sigh, Elliot agreed to the idea. The interview was scheduled for the end of that same week, a meeting that promised more than just words. Grace adjusted the recorder in her bag while waiting in the lobby of the building where Elliot lived. The journalist, in her early 30s, was known for her keen ability to capture the essence of artists in her articles, but today she carried an additional burden. She knew something Elliot didn't. The diagnosis he believed to be definitive was nothing more than a medical error. She had discovered this while researching for the interview, but decided not to reveal the truth, at least not yet. Perhaps, she thought, that error could serve a greater purpose, to help Elliot rediscover the passion he seemed to have lost. When Elliot greeted her, Grace was immediately struck by his presence. Tall, with impeccable posture, he carried the intensity of a man who had lived his art to the fullest. However, his eyes betrayed a profound exhaustion, as if he were constantly in battle. "Come in," Elliot said, leading her to the living room. "Can I offer you something? Coffee? Tea? Tea would be great. Thank you." While he prepared the drink, Grace observed the space. Black and white photographs of dancers in motion adorned the walls. A grand piano occupied the corner, with stacks of sheet music neatly organized beside it. It was as if every element of that apartment was a fragment of Elliot's soul, and she knew the man before her was about to lose everything that defined him. The interview began formally, with questions about his career, his greatest influences, and his most significant moments. Elliot responded gracefully, but seemed distant, as if narrating someone else's life. "Dance has always been my purest form of expression," he said at one point, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window. "But everything has an end, doesn't it?" Grace hesitated before asking the next question. She felt the growing tension between what she knew and what he believed to be true. "You spoke about ends. Can you tell me more about what that means to you right now?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. Elliot smiled bitterly before answering. "I'm planning my final performance. Something grand. A farewell that captures everything I've been and what I've meant through my art. After that, I'll step away from the stage." Grace felt a pang in her chest. The conviction in his voice was overwhelming, even though it was based on a false premise. "That sounds incredible, Elliot." She paused. "Have you thought about how this farewell might impact you personally? I mean, outside the stage." For a moment, Elliot seemed vulnerable. He ran a hand through his hair, sighing before answering. "To be honest, I don't know who I am without dance. I'm afraid to find out." The answer reverberated within Grace. She saw not just an artist in crisis, but a man struggling to understand his place in the world. The interview continued for a few more minutes, but for both of them, something essential had already been established. A common ground of pain and hope. When Grace said goodbye, Elliot remained in the living room, staring out the window. The decision to perform his final dance seemed more concrete than ever. What he didn't know was that, at that same moment, Grace was also making her own choice to accompany him on his journey, even if it meant carrying a secret that could change everything. The week passed quickly, but not without the growing weight of Elliot and Grace's reflections. He, determined to turn his farewell into something memorable. She, restless, caught in the dilemma of revealing or hiding the truth about the diagnosis. It was a cold and sunny afternoon when Grace returned to Elliot's apartment to continue the interview. He greeted her with a smile that, though sincere, carried a melancholy she was beginning to recognize in his gestures. "I've been thinking about something," Elliot said as soon as she sat down. "Something that goes far beyond a single performance." Grace placed the recorder on the table, but he didn't let her turn it on. It was clear that this was not just a moment of documentation, but a more personal conversation. "I want to organize a tour," he continued. "One last tour. Something that celebrates not only my career, but everything that dance has meant to me and to the audience." The idea caught Grace by surprise. She folded her hands in her lap, trying to organize her thoughts. On one hand, she understood the appeal of the proposal. For Elliot, it would be a farewell worthy of his grandeur. On the other hand, she knew this decision was based on a lie and feared the consequences of perpetuating it. "A tour," she repeated, more to herself than to him. "That's ambitious." "Exactly," said Elliot, with a spark of enthusiasm he hadn't felt in months. "I want it to be something memorable, Grace. Not just for me, but for everyone who's followed my journey. A celebration before the inevitable." "Do you already have something in mind?" "Venues, dates." "Not yet. I want your help with that. You're good at capturing stories and moments. Who better to document this journey?" Grace felt her heart race. It was an offer impossible to refuse professionally, but the ethical dilemma gnawed at her. She knew that by accepting, she would be committing not only to accompany Elliot, but to carry the weight of a secret that could destroy him. "I'm flattered," she replied, carefully choosing her words. "And you're right, this story deserves to be told." Elliot relaxed on the couch, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He trusted her, and that made Grace feel even guiltier. She knew she would have to decide the right moment to tell the truth, but for now, she chose to be carried away by the hope she saw in his eyes. In the following days, the idea of the tour took shape. Elliot reached out to old colleagues and theaters where he had performed over the years. The responses were enthusiastic, as he expected. The dance world wanted to celebrate his contribution to the art, and tickets for the first performances sold out quickly. For Grace, accompanying the process was an emotional roller coaster. She watched him rehearse with renewed intensity, as if each movement were a silent prayer to what he was about to lose. Behind the scenes, however, she saw moments of fragility, longer pauses, deeper sighs, and the distant gaze of someone already saying goodbye. One afternoon, while they were reviewing the logistical details of the tour, Elliot looked at her with a curious expression. "Do you think people can find beauty in pain?" Grace took a while to respond. She felt that this wasn't just any question but a reflection of Elliot's soul. "I think so," she finally said. "Sometimes, pain makes us see what really matters. Like now, for example. You're creating something you never would have imagined if you weren't going through this." Elliot nodded, thoughtful. His vulnerability was evident, but it was also clear that he had found a purpose in it. Grace, on the other hand, felt the weight of the secret becoming more unbearable each day. The plan was in motion. The first performance would be in a historic theater that had been the stage for one of the most iconic moments of his career. Elliot was ready to begin his final tour, and Grace was ready to document every step of this journey, even knowing the real challenge was yet to come. The cold of that night seemed to amplify the tension in the air. The historic theater, with its imposing and ornate architecture, was illuminated like a beacon in the darkness. Elliot Carter sat backstage, on a wooden chair in front of a mirror tarnished by time. The reflection before him showed a different man, still strong, still imposing, but with eyes that carried an invisible weight. Grace entered silently, carrying her camera and notebook. She hesitated before speaking, watching him adjust the laces of his ballet shoes with an almost ceremonial care. "Ready for the big moment?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Elliot raised his eyes to her and smiled, a restrained smile that didn't reach his eyes. "As ready as I've ever been." But also, as if it were the first time, Grace didn't reply. She knew that, for him, that night was more than just a performance. It was the beginning of a farewell. She decided then to leave the recorder running on the table, capturing the moment without interfering. The auditorium was packed. Longtime admirers, young dancers, and respected critics waited eagerly as the lights dimmed. When the curtains opened, Elliot emerged from the darkness, his body sculpting movements that seemed to defy time. Each leap, each spin, was executed with a precision that made the audience hold their breath. Grace watched from backstage, her heart pounding in rhythm with the music. There was something almost otherworldly about the way Elliot danced, as if he were channeling every emotion he had bottled up over the years. The audience seemed to feel it too. The silence between the movements was as intense as the applause that erupted at the end of each act. However, in the intervals between scenes, Elliot showed another side. Behind the curtains, he leaned against the walls, sweat streaming down his face as he tried to catch his breath. Grace noticed that the effort was taking a greater toll than he admitted. "You need a longer break between acts," she suggested, approaching with a bottle of water. "No, I'm fine. It's just adrenaline." But his hand trembled slightly as he took the bottle. The end of the performance was apotheotic. When the curtains closed, the theater erupted into seemingly endless applause. Elliot remained on stage for a few moments, absorbing every second, before taking a deep bow. Later, in the backstage dressing room, the atmosphere was filled with a mix of euphoria and exhaustion. Colleagues and admirers came to congratulate him, but Elliot seemed distant, as if he were still processing what had happened. Grace waited until the crowd had dispersed before approaching him. She found him sitting in the same place as before, this time with slumped shoulders and closed eyes. "You are incredible," she said, breaking the silence. Elliot opened his eyes slowly and gave a faint smile. "It was different. I felt alive out there, but I also realize how much it's taking out of me." Grace felt the tension in his words. She wanted to comfort him, but knew the journey had barely begun. "Maybe what you're feeling is the weight of what this means to you. But, Elliot, this is affecting people in ways you can't even imagine." He looked at her for a moment, as if evaluating the sincerity of her words. Finally, he nodded. "Then, I guess it's worth continuing. For now." Grace understood that those words carried a silent promise. Elliot would continue, even if he bore the weight of his own sacrifice. The tour moved forward, and with each new performance, the relationship between Elliot and Grace gained a new layer of depth. Although both were focused on the success of the journey, there were moments of pause when the weight of their emotions seemed to speak louder than any words spoken. That night, the second performance took place in a smaller but equally charming theater. Elliot stepped onto the stage with his usual intensity, every movement laden with meaning. Grace watched from the wings, unable to look away, not just because of the performance, but because of the man he was in that exact moment. Something about him drew her in, perhaps it was the mix of vulnerability and strength he demonstrated. After the show, the backstage was quieter than usual. The team and admirers respected Elliot's exhaustion, leaving him in peace. Grace took the opportunity to approach him. "You always give your all on stage, don't you?" she remarked, sitting down beside him. "I don't know how to do it any other way. It's the only way I know to be honest with myself and with the audience." Grace nodded, feeling the intensity of those words. There was something almost tangible in the connection forming between them, as if every confession brought them closer. She hesitated before continuing. And with yourself? Do you think you've been fair to yourself? The question hung in the air for a moment. Elliot looked away, reflecting before responding. Maybe not. But the truth is, I don't know who I am outside of this, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the stage. Dance is all I know. Grace wanted to say something comforting but realized he didn't need comfort at that moment. He needed understanding. And that's what she offered, simply staying by his side, in silence. In the following days, the dynamic between them began to change. Small gestures, a shared coffee at dawn, a smile exchanged backstage, a glance that lingered a second longer than usual started to fill the spaces between performances. Grace noticed she was becoming more and more involved, but she tried to keep her focus on her mission, documenting Elliot's journey. During the third performance, in a larger city, the audience went wild over Elliot's performance. He seemed to transcend the limitations of his body, moving as if he were made of wind and fire. Grace filmed him from the back of the auditorium, her hands steady on the camera, but her heart racing. There was something more to all of it. Something that went beyond art, beyond the performance. After the show, they walked together to the hotel, a quiet stroll through the night illuminated by street lamps. Elliot seemed relaxed, almost happy, as if for a moment he had forgotten the weight he carried. "You are brilliant today," Grace said, breaking the silence. He smiled at her, a genuine smile this time. "Thank you. But it's strange. While I was dancing, I found myself thinking about you." Grace felt a warmth rise to her face, but masked it with a nervous laugh. "I hope that didn't interfere with your performance." Elliot stopped walking and looked at her, his expression serious, but gentle. "Quite the opposite. It gave me strength." For a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. Grace felt her heart beat faster, but before she could respond, Elliot looked away and continued walking. That night, while reviewing the footage in her hotel room, Grace couldn't get Elliot's words out of her head. Something between them was changing, and she knew she needed to be careful. There was a lot at stake, and the secret she carried made everything even more complicated. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't think only about the weight of the truth. She thought about the sparkle in Elliot's eyes when he looked at her, and that somehow made everything feel a little lighter. The tour continued its course, but that night, in a city with classical architecture, brought something different. The theater, with its hand-painted ceiling and golden chandeliers, had witnessed one of Elliot's most emotional performances so far. After the performance, the theater slowly emptied. Elliot remained backstage. Grace entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of hot tea she had picked up from the makeshift kitchen in the dressing rooms. "I thought you might need this," she said, handing him one of the cups. He accepted it with a tired but warm smile. "Thank you. You always seem to know what I need before I even realize it." Grace chuckled softly and sat on the bench beside him. For a few moments, the silence was filled only by the sound of the warm liquid being sipped. Then, Elliot broke the silence. "This might have been my best performance since the start of the tour. It was stunning. The way you move, it's like the stage is an extension of you." Grace hesitated before adding, "I don't think I've ever seen anything so beautiful." Elliot turned to her, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to decipher something. He set the cup aside and extended his hand to her. "Would you like to dance?" Grace blinked, surprised. "Here? Now? Why not?" Sometimes the best moments are the most unexpected. She hesitated for a moment, but eventually took his hand. He led her to the center of the empty hall, where the soft light of a single spotlight illuminated the space. Without music, they moved in perfect harmony. Elliot guided her gently, his movements still graceful despite his exhaustion. Grace followed his rhythm, feeling more connected to him than ever. For a moment, it seemed as if the world had disappeared, leaving only the two of them. When they finally stopped, Grace realized her breathing was quickened, not just from the movement, but from their closeness. "You are remarkable," she said, looking directly into his eyes. Elliot smiled, and there was something more in his gaze that night, something he hadn't allowed to show before. "Maybe it's you who inspires me to be this way." Grace felt her heart race, but didn't respond. Instead, they both returned to the backstage area, a comfortable silence between them. In the days that followed, Elliot seemed different. There was a lightness in his steps, even off stage. His rehearsals remained intense, but he no longer carried the same weight as before. Grace noticed the changes, but also knew that his limited time still hung over their heads. One afternoon, while they were walking together in a park near the hotel, Elliot said something that caught her by surprise. "You know, Grace, for a long time, I lived for dance. But now, I think I'm finally learning to live for something more." She stopped walking, looking at him. "What do you mean by that?" Elliot also stopped, turning to face her. There was a vulnerable sincerity in his gaze. "I mean that, for the first time in a long while, I feel like I have something more to fight for. Something beyond the applause and the stage." Grace didn't know what to say. She felt he was referring to her, but the weight of her secret prevented her from fully surrendering to the moment. "I'm happy for you, Elliot. You deserve that." He gave a small smile and placed his hand on her shoulder briefly before they resumed walking. Both knew that something between them was changing, but neither dared to put it into words. For Elliot, however, Grace's presence was enough to give meaning to every step of this journey. The following days brought a mix of routine and restlessness for Elliot and Grace. The performances remained impressive, but something different began to surface. Backstage, small signs that Elliot's physical limitations weren't as severe as he believed started to raise doubts. A movement that seemed too easy, an unexpected lightness in his posture. Grace noticed, but didn't dare address the subject. One night during rehearsal, the theater was empty except for a few technical crew members. Elliot was going through a sequence of repetitive movements, exploring the fluidity of his performance for the next show. Grace sat in the audience, watching attentively. "Strange," he murmured, stopping at the center of the stage. "It feels easier today." Grace lifted her head from her notebook. "What do you mean?" "These movements. Normally, they would be more challenging. But my body, I can't explain it. It feels like it's responding better than expected." She tried to keep her expression neutral, but his doubt reflected the growing tension she felt about the secret she was keeping. Grace quickly changed the subject, encouraging him to focus on the next part of the rehearsal. That night, after everyone had left the theater, Grace remained seated in one of the chairs, reviewing her notes. Elliot returned to the stage, wearing a light sweatshirt, his expression pensive. "Can I ask you something, Grace?" he said, breaking the silence. She looked up, surprised by the interruption. "Of course. Do you think it's possible to be wrong about something you consider absolute? Something that defines everything you are?" Grace felt a chill down her spine. It was as if he was getting closer to a truth she wasn't ready to reveal. She searched for a careful response. "I think sometimes we can hold on to an idea, a fear, that prevents us from seeing the bigger picture. But it's hard to admit that when you're in the middle of it." Elliot nodded, reflecting in silence before changing the subject. But the tension lingered between them like an invisible shadow. In the days that followed, Elliot's doubts began to grow. He noticed small improvements that didn't make sense within what he expected from his condition. During an especially intense rehearsal, he stopped abruptly, staring at Grace, who was filming from the audience. "You've noticed, haven't you?" he asked, his voice full of suspicion. Grace froze, gripping the camera tighter than necessary. "Noticed what?" "That my body isn't deteriorating as it should." "Something isn't right, Grace." She knew she couldn't lie outright. "Maybe it's your determination. You've been fighting so hard. Maybe you're overcoming the limits you thought you had." Elliot didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press further. He returned to his movements, but his expression showed that the seed of doubt had been planted. Later, Grace sat alone in her hotel room, the camera by her side and her notes scattered across the table. She knew the truth couldn't be hidden much longer, but she feared the impact it would have on Elliot. Meanwhile, Elliot, across the hallway, looked at his hands. He moved his fingers, opening and closing his palms, feeling a strength he didn't completely understand. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if he should trust what he believed to be his reality. That evening, when they returned to the hotel, Elliot knocked on Grace's door. He was tense but determined.
"Can we talk?"
he asked, his voice laden with something she couldn't immediately identify. She gestured for him to come in. They sat side by side at the small wooden table in the room, the silence between them heavy. "I need to know, Grace," Elliot said. "Something doesn't make sense. My body, my limitations, everything feels different from what it should be. You know something you haven't told me, don't you?" She averted her eyes, feeling the weight of guilt. She knew she couldn't keep hiding the truth. "Elliot," she began, but her voice faltered. She took a deep breath, gathering courage. "I found out before the tour started that the diagnosis you received was wrong." The silence that followed was like a silent explosion. Elliot blinked a few times, as if processing each word individually. "Wrong? What do you mean, wrong?" he asked, his voice low and filled with disbelief. "Your doctor made a mistake. You don't have the degenerative condition he mentioned. Your body is fine. It always has been. I didn't know how to tell you, Elliot. I thought, maybe this could give you a reason to live every moment intensely." He stood up abruptly, stepping away from her. He walked to the window, looking out at the lit street below. "You knew? This whole time? And you let me believe I was losing everything?" Grace stood up as well, feeling the pain in his voice as if it were her own. "I didn't know what to do. You were so lost, so directionless. I thought maybe this could help." Elliot turned to face her, his eyes shining with anger and disappointment. "Help? You think lying to me was the best way to help?" Grace felt tears welling up, but she held them back. She knew she had no excuses that could fix the damage in that moment. "I made a mistake, Elliot. I know I did. But everything I did was because I care about you. More than I should." The words hung between them, carrying a weight neither seemed able to bear. Elliot ran a hand through his hair, exhaling a long, heavy sigh. "I need time," he said finally. "Time to think, to process all of this." Grace nodded, unable to find words. Elliot left the room, leaving her alone with the emptiness his words had left behind. That night, Elliot walked through the city streets, lost in thought. He felt a mix of relief and betrayal that he didn't know how to reconcile. The idea that he had lived a lie consumed him, but at the same time, he couldn't deny that the tour had transformed him. He had rediscovered his passion for dance, for himself, for something beyond diagnoses and imposed limits. When he finally returned to the hotel, the decision was still unclear, but something inside him knew that this journey was far from over. Later that morning, Elliot met his old mentor Charles at a small cafe in the city. Charles was an older man with piercing eyes and a serene smile that seemed to carry years of wisdom. "Elliot, it's good to see you," Charles said, shaking his hand firmly. "But you look troubled. Is something wrong?" Elliot hesitated, but realized there was no reason to hide the truth. "I found out that my condition is non-existent. I'm not sick." He paused, watching his mentor's reaction. "But Grace knew this all along and didn't tell me." Charles furrowed his brow slightly before responding. "And how do you feel about that?"
"Confused. Betrayed.
But also free. Like everything I believed was wrong, but now I have a chance to start over." Charles nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Elliot. "Sometimes, the greatest truths come from the greatest pains. Grace may have made a mistake, but look at what it brought you. A new perspective, a renewed passion. You have a choice now, Elliot. You can use this as an excuse to close yourself off or as momentum for something greater." Elliot remained silent, absorbing Charles's words. He knew his mentor was right, but he still felt the weight of making a decision. The following days brought a mix of routine and restlessness for Elliot and Grace. The performances remained impressive, but something different began to surface. Backstage, small signs that Elliot's physical limitations weren't as severe as he believed started to raise doubts. A movement that seemed too easy, an unexpected lightness in his posture. Grace noticed, but didn't dare address the subject. One night during rehearsal, the theater was empty except for a few technical crew members. Elliot was going through a sequence of repetitive movements, exploring the fluidity of his performance for the next show. Grace sat in the audience, watching attentively. "Strange," he murmured, stopping at the center of the stage. "It feels easier today." Grace lifted her head from her notebook. "What do you mean?" "These movements. Normally, they would be more challenging. But my body, I can't explain it. It feels like it's responding better than expected." She tried to keep her expression neutral, but his doubt reflected the growing tension she felt about the secret she was keeping. Grace quickly changed the subject, encouraging him to focus on the next part of the rehearsal. Meanwhile, Grace sat in her hotel room, staring at the blank screen of her laptop. She had tried to write something to Elliot, an apology letter, an explanation, anything that could express what she felt, but the words simply wouldn't come. She felt consumed by guilt and fear that her decision to hide the truth had destroyed what they had been building together. When she finally managed to write, the words came in an uncontrolled flow. "Elliot, I know what I did was wrong. I know there is no excuse that could justify my silence. But everything I did was motivated by the respect and admiration I have for you. When I discovered the truth, I was afraid you would give up, that you would lose the passion that so deeply inspires the people around you. Now I see that I underestimated your strength. You are more than a dancer. You are incredible, a fighter. And if you give me the chance, I would like to stay by your side, not as a journalist, but as someone who deeply cares for you. With all my heart, Grace." She hesitated before sending the email. Finally, with a deep sigh, she clicked send. Later that night, Elliot received Grace's message. He read each word slowly, feeling the weight of the sincerity in her writing. He knew the path to reconciliation wouldn't be easy, but something in her message deeply moved him. Lying in bed, he thought about the future. The tour was not yet over, and he felt that something greater was waiting for him, something beyond applause or performances. For the first time, he felt a spark of genuine hope, both for his career and for what might happen between him and Grace. The final stage of Elliot's tour had been carefully chosen, a historic theater whose imposing facade and ornate interior symbolized the grandeur of a career marked by unforgettable moments. The event promised to be more than just a performance. It was a celebration of everything he had overcome and all the emotions he had shared with the world. As the audience filled the seats, Elliot was in the dressing room, adjusting his one constant companion, his dance shoes. There was an unusual silence in the air, broken only by his controlled breathing and the soft music playing in the background. Every movement he made was deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if he was preparing not just for a performance, but for an act of redemption. Grace entered quietly, holding the camera she had used throughout the tour. The tension between them had eased in recent days, but there was still an invisible barrier. She watched him for a moment before speaking. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice low, almost as if she feared interrupting him. Elliot raised his eyes to her and smiled faintly. "I think so. It's not about being ready anymore. It's about being present." Grace nodded, understanding that this night was not just the end of a tour but a new beginning for him. Before leaving, she placed a gentle hand on Elliot's shoulder, a silent gesture of support that he acknowledged with a nod. When the theater lights dimmed, a profound silence fell over the audience. The curtain rose slowly, revealing Elliot at the center of the stage, surrounded by a halo of soft light. The music began, and he moved with a grace and intensity that captivated every gaze. Each step, each leap, seemed to tell a story, not just of a dancer, but of a man who had found meaning even in adversity. Backstage, Grace watched, the camera forgotten at her side. For the first time, she felt no need to document. She preferred to absorb the moment in its entirety. Every movement of Elliot seemed to reflect who he had become, not a man defined by his art, but someone who used it to express who he truly was. The performance culminated in a final movement, a pose that seemed suspended in time. The silence that followed was broken by an explosion of applause, the sound echoing through the walls of the theater. Elliot held the pose for a moment before bowing deeply, allowing himself to absorb the energy of the audience. After the performance, he finally found Grace. She was leaning against a wall, watching him with a quiet smile. He approached her, his breathing still slightly labored. "What did you think?" he asked hesitantly. "I thought you were extraordinary." "As always," Grace replied, her voice laden with emotion. There was a moment of silence between them, filled only by the distant voices in the dressing room. Then, Elliot stepped closer. "Grace, I wouldn't have made it here without you. Even with everything that happened, you were the person who helped me see what really matters." Grace felt her cheeks flush, but kept her gaze fixed on his. "You helped me too, Elliot. More than you realize." He smiled, and for a moment, it seemed the weight of everything they had been through had lifted. There was no need for more words. Both knew that this moment marked not just the end of a tour, but the beginning of something much greater. The week following the final performance was marked by silence and reflection. Elliot chose to stay in the city for a few days, seeking some tranquility after the intensity of the tour. Grace, for her part, respected his space, torn between the hope for complete reconciliation and the fear that she had gone too far. One sunny afternoon, Elliot finally took the initiative. He invited Grace to meet him at the park near the theater where they had concluded the tour. When she arrived, he was sitting on a bench under an imposing tree, watching the leaves fall with the breeze. "Thank you for coming," Elliot said, standing as soon as he saw her. "I thought we needed to talk," she replied, her voice laden with caution. Elliot nodded and gestured toward the bench.
"Sit down."
"There's something I want to say." Grace complied, sitting beside him. For a moment, he remained silent, as if organizing his thoughts. Then he finally spoke. "When you told me the truth about the diagnosis, it felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. It was as if all my struggle, all my suffering, had been built on a lie." She lowered her gaze, unable to face the weight of his words. But he continued, his voice softer now. "Over time, I realized something. I wouldn't be here today, wouldn't have done this tour if you hadn't made that decision. As much as I hated what you did, I'm also grateful." Grace looked up, surprised by the confession. "You forgive me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elliot looked directly at her, a small smile forming on his lips. "I forgive you, and I hope we can start over. Not just as a dancer and a journalist, but as two people who found each other in a complicated moment and decided to grow together." Grace felt tears well up, but this time they were of relief. She nodded, smiling as she quickly wiped her eyes. "I'd love that, Elliot." A few days later, a new meeting was scheduled to finalize the interview. That night, Elliot's apartment felt different, more intimate and welcoming. The soft lights reflected on the walls adorned with black and white frames, creating a nostalgic atmosphere now imbued with a greater emotional weight. Both knew that this meeting transcended the mere conclusion of an article. Grace arrived promptly, carrying the notebook and camera that always accompanied her. Elliot greeted her with a restrained smile, wearing a simple yet impeccable shirt that seemed to mirror his apparent calm. "It seems fitting to end everything here, where it began," he said, guiding her to the sofa. "I agree," Grace replied, settling in. "This place has something special." There was a brief silence as she organized her questions, and he watched her attentively. When Grace finally looked up, she found Elliot's eyes fixed on hers, more intense than ever. "Before we start," he said, his voice slightly lower, "I want to say something I've been holding back." Grace paused, her breathing quickening slightly. She set the notebook aside, realizing that the words about to be spoken were more important than any interview. "Grace, since you came into my life, everything changed. At first, I thought it was just a reflection of the tour, of the moment I was living. But over time, I realized you're much more than a journalist who came to tell my story. You're a part of it now." She remained silent, but the sparkle in her eyes said everything. Elliot moved closer, sitting beside her on the sofa. "When everything felt lost, you were my light. You showed me that life can be more than applause, more than choreography. You made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, passion for life, for myself." He took a deep breath, summoning courage.
"And for you."
Grace felt warmth rise to her cheeks. She had never imagined those words would come from Elliot, so sincere, so full of emotion. Without thinking much, she placed her hand on his. "I felt something different too, from the beginning. You're not just a story to tell, Elliot. You're the person who made me want to be present, to live every moment." He smiled, and before she could say anything more, he leaned in gently, his lips meeting hers in a tender, yet intense kiss. It was as if all the weight of the past dissolved, leaving only the present, only the two of them in that instant. When they parted, Elliot looked at her, still smiling.
"Thank you, Grace, for everything."
She returned the smile, her eyes shining. "I think I'm the one who should be thanking you." In the months that followed, Elliot and Grace continued to build something far beyond the tour or the article. He found in her a partner, both in life and in art, while she discovered in him the inspiration to write the most authentic stories of her career
And
of her life. If you enjoyed this heartfelt story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.